Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing. Dr. Jessie Stern, thank you very much for joining me on the Mental Wellbeing Show. Excited for this one, for attachment styles. I wanted to start by asking you and just perhaps grounding us conceptually as to what attachment styles are.
It's a good question. Attachment styles are our unique pattern in close relationships. So an attachment is an emotional bond that we have with, could be multiple people in our lives. And typically those people with whom we form an attachment are those who serve as what's called a secure base. They're people who have our back in times of trouble. So there are a variety of relationships that we might have in the course of our lifetime. And usually, a friendship could be either really fleeting, someone who we just know during a certain period in our lives and then the relationship dissolves, or it could be a much deeper relationship where we're really depending on one another, leaning on each other in times of difficulty. And it's usually those periods of stress that can build an attachment bond. So if we have gone through something really serious together and I can depend on you, that is kind of the crucible for an attachment bond being formed. And an attachment style is really the unique pattern that I have in that relationship within an attachment bond.
Okay, so attachment styles go beyond just the infant caregiver relationship. Obviously, they are in every relationship by the sounds of it.
Absolutely, yeah. So we can think about the earliest relationship experiences that we've had. So we might start by thinking of the infant caregiver relationship for sure. And that's where attachment theory really starts. So in the 1980s and even a little bit before, John Bowlby was looking at infants who had been orphaned during World War II. So at the time, all of these orphanages all throughout Europe were being filled up with infants who had lost caregivers. And the question at the time was, why don't these infants tend to develop typically if they're given things like food, shelter, clothing, warmth? All of their physical needs are being taken care of. And yet, what researchers were seeing in these orphanages is that kids were failing to grow and in a lot of cases getting sick and dying. And so John Bowlby and other researchers decided to go in and really see what was happening in these orphanages. And one of the things they noticed was that infants were not held. There was very little physical touch, and there was very little social interaction. And it turns out decades later that infants really, really need social interaction for the development of the brain, because as humans, we're hardwired for relationship. So attachment does start in infancy. It's one of our fundamental needs as little humans, but that need does not go away even when we become independent adults. We still need close relationships, attachments. They're just going to look different in adulthood.
So we all have attachment bonds and attachment styles, but they vary in what those styles are, right? So what are the different attachment styles that one might have?
There are four main types of attachment style. In infancy, we usually call these attachment categories or patterns of attachment is what Mary Ainsworth would call them. And these come out of research that psychologist Mary Ainsworth conducted in both Uganda and in Baltimore in the United States. And her findings have been really well replicated across different cultures. But basically what she noticed was, depending on the unique rhythm of interaction between an infant and a caregiver, an infant forms unique patterns of behavior, and those patterns are basically an infant's best strategy for getting their needs met in that relationship. So one pattern that she noticed was caregivers who responded pretty consistently and sensitively to their child's need. For example, a child is really upset and crying. On average, this caregiver picks up the child, offers comfort, and then allows them to explore. So generally sensitive caregiving, by no means do you have to be a perfect parent, right? There's no such thing as a perfect parent. But on average, this caregiver can be expected to respond sensitively to a child's needs. That child is likely to develop secure attachment. Secure attachment is just the sense of confidence that the caregiver is going to be there when you need them. And typically what you see in securely attached kids is when a caregiver is present, they're confident exploring their environment. So being securely attached doesn't mean you're clinging to a caregiver. It doesn't mean you're strongly attached or don't want to separate, although, most kids don't want to be separated from their caregiver. But it does mean that you have the confidence that your caregiver is available, and that confidence allows you to explore your environment freely. So usually securely attached kids are actually the most exploratory when the caregiver is present. They're also likely to get upset if a caregiver leaves unexpectedly, or if they're going through a separation that they're not accustomed to, maybe a new babysitter or dropping off at daycare for the first time. But they'll acclimate. And then when the caregiver returns, the hallmark of secure attachment is that the infant is really happy to see them when they come back. It's almost like they're saying, "Oh, I missed you so much. It's so great that you're back." So that's secure attachment. A second pattern of attachment is when caregivers are not emotionally available, or maybe they dismiss infants' needs. So if an infant is crying, rather than saying, "Oh, come here, let me comfort you," the typical response would be, "Quit crying. Don't be such a crybaby," perhaps minimizing the child's emotions. And over time, children learn that if I express my need to this caregiver, I'm probably going to be rejected. So to avoid the pain of rejection, their best strategy for staying in relationship to that caregiver is to avoid showing their needs. So avoidant kids will tend to tamp down their emotions. A lot of avoidant kids actually look very independent when you just sort of see them on their own. But what's happening physiologically is actually avoidant infants are quite distressed often when their caregiver leaves, even if they don't show it outwardly. So typically these infants don't show their needs as openly. And when a caregiver comes back after a period of separation, they tend to avoid contact. So that's why it's called avoidant. They might avoid physical touch by turning away. They might avoid eye contact. And there's not that same "I'm so happy to see you" quality that you see with secure kids. So that's the second type. The third type is another type of insecure attachment and for these caregivers, they're typically a little bit inconsistent or hard to predict. Sometimes they're available, sometimes they're sensitive, sometimes they're totally unavailable. And it's really hard for kids to get their needs met unless they really amp up their needs or their distress. So their best strategy for an inconsistent caregiver, okay, sometimes you're there for me, sometimes you're not. My best strategy is to amp things up, cry a lot, cry loudly, and cling to you. Because if I don't, maybe you won't be there for me when I need you. So usually anxiously attached kids look more dependent. They sometimes behave in a way that's a little bit young for their age. They'll sometimes also get very passive if their caregiver leaves, or angry. So there are these different subtypes that we don't have to go into, but one type of anxious attachment is anger. I'm so pissed off at you that you left me. How could you? And even when a caregiver returns, oftentimes these infants both want to be close to the caregiver and push them away. They're sometimes called ambivalent because of that. It's like, I want to be close to you, but also F you for leaving me. So there's both of those things happening at the same time. The last category of attachment, which was added later in some clinical observations by a woman named Mary Main, is disorganized attachment. These kids have often experienced frightened or frightening caregiving, meaning the person who was supposed to be their secure base wasn't, for whatever set of reasons, maybe their own trauma or being in a really difficult situation, they weren't able to be a secure base for this child, and so they can't form a coherent strategy. Maybe this parent is the victim of domestic violence. Maybe this parent themselves is abusive or neglectful. Or maybe the caregiver is just so unpredictable that the kid can't use a consistent strategy to get their needs met. And because of that, these kids tend to have the worst outcomes. What you'll see is a disoriented pattern of behavior. So sometimes when parents will separate or return, These disorganized infants will show unusual body postures. They might hunch their shoulders or make their posture quite small, or they might freeze or look especially terrified. They also sometimes will be aggressive toward a caregiver. It's such a diverse category that it's sort of hard to describe. But the basic idea is that when your typical attachment strategies fail, disorganized attachment is the result.
So, with all four of those categories, then, is it fair to say that even like particularly in that avoidant attachment style, where outwardly it looks like perhaps the infant, like you said, is independent and perhaps doesn't need that attachment as much as possible, what's going on underneath is that no matter what the attachment style, infants do crave that attachment to their caregiver?
Yeah, typically when you look at physiological markers, um, most typically developing infants are born with neural circuitry and biological mechanisms to form bonds. And the reason for that is because in our evolutionary history, we were much more likely to survive our unusually long period of infancy. Humans have this really long thing called childhood that most other species don't have. And part of the way that we can survive and eventually reproduce is by forming social relationships, so forming attachments. So it is baked into our biology. And there's another body of work by my colleague James Cone called social baseline theory. And what he's found in adults through a lot of neuroscientific study is that the baseline expectation of our brain is that other humans will be available to us in stressful periods. And when they're not, our amygdala, the area of the brain, it's a subcortical area toward the middle of the brain, our amygdala becomes especially active if we're under stress with nobody there to buffer that stress. So this is even true in adults. And in infants, regardless of your attachment style, regardless of how you navigate staying close to someone based on your previous experience, you still have you still have the basic biology of a human, which is to say a social biology. If you're under threat and you have social resources available to you, social support, being able to call a friend or holding somebody's hand, so having like a physical touch reminder that someone's present and supportive, all of those things can help mitigate the stress response. And it actually frees up resources in your brain. So whether you're an infant or an adult, whether you're, securely attached or insecurely attached, having social resources available actually allows your brain and body to function more efficiently.
Okay, so off the back of those four attachment styles, then, I'm wondering, I'm not a parent, Jesse, but I one day would like to be. Is it ever, and I suppose this is a value judgment, but is it ever, given the choice, ideal to have an insecure attachment with your infant? Or is a secure attachment really what we should all be striving for, again, given the choice?
That's an excellent question. In general, we have about 6 decades of research now showing that securely attached children, on average, tend to show the best developmental outcomes in a few different domains. One is self-regulation, or the ability to calm yourself down under stress. Securely attached kids, because they've got a history of their needs being met and learning to regulate emotion in relationship, can then go on and do that themselves. And partly because securely attached kids learn how to calm their own physiology, they're better equipped to deal with stress, which means they have better mental health outcomes. Similarly, in the long haul, if you've got a better ability to regulate stress and perhaps a better social network because you've got these social skills built in your first relationships, your long-term health on average tends to be better. And in part, this is because when you're navigating stress, one of the things that happens in the body is inflammation. Inflammation is a normal part of our body's response to injury or illness, but chronic inflammation is part of really awful chronic diseases like heart disease, for example. If you've got a secure attachment, you're at lower risk of chronic inflammation because you can avail yourself of these social resources. Some of my own research shows that kids who are securely attached are protected from certain risk factors in their environment, like mom's depression, for example. So if you have a depressed parent, but in spite of that, you can still form a secure attachment with them, you're less likely to then develop depressive symptoms yourself in the preschool period. You're also more likely to show greater prosocial behavior and empathy. So all of these markers across many, many studies, not just my own, but many researchers, tend to show that secure attachment reduces your risk for things like psychopathology and long-term health risk, and increases things like social skills, school readiness, and emotion regulation. On the other hand, there are probably certain environments where being avoidant is adaptive. If you're in a really rough neighborhood, for example, and you probably shouldn't trust everybody you meet, having a little bit of avoidance is probably a good thing. And let's say you're in prison for whatever set of reasons, being avoidant is going to serve you quite well in terms of self-protection. The thing to know about attachment, though, is these are dynamic and flexible systems that we've got. So being securely attached in childhood and then being met with an environment where it's not safe to trust other people as you would just being naturally secure, we can flexibly adapt to new contexts. And typically, being secure in childhood gives you the most flexibility in the way that you choose to navigate relationships. So I would say if you can, it's good to invest in secure attachment with your future child.
So on that point of flexibility then, I know we discussed 4 types of attachment styles, but are these really kind of like on a dimension rather than kind of discrete categories?
Yes, it's such a good question. And what the newer data is showing, especially in adulthood, is that even though we love to put human beings in categories and boxes because it's a shortcut for our brain, it's not the way the world works. And probably for every human trait, whether you're talking about personality traits or something like attachment, it's on a spectrum. So often adult attachment researchers will use 2 dimensions to measure attachment, and you can take a quiz if you would like using this very highly regarded measure called the Experiences in Close Relationship Scale, or the ECR. And the ECR will give you a score along 2 dimensions. One is anxious attachment style, and one is avoidant attachment style. So you can get basically this 2-dimensional model of your attachment. If you're low on both anxiety and avoidance, you're more secure. If you're high on avoidance, but pretty low on anxiety, you're probably more avoidant. If you're high on anxiety, relatively low on avoidance, you're probably more likely to be anxious in general. And if you're high on both anxiety and avoidance, this is sort of the adult equivalent of disorganized, but we call it fearful dismissing. There's too much jargon in attachment theory, in my opinion. All you have to know is that there are these 2 dimensions in adult attachment, anxiety and avoidance, and they do a really, really good job of predicting patterns of emotions and behavior in close relationships, especially romantic relationships. They also do a really good job of predicting your parenting behavior and the way that you interact with close friends and family members. So just as an example of this, for romantic partners, individuals who are more avoidant, so they tend to endorse statements like, I prefer not to depend on other people, or I'm not comfortable showing people how I feel deep down. In general, there's a sense of like, I like keeping people at arm's length, and I don't really like showing what's going on in here. I'd rather just keep everybody kind of like this. Typically, for avoidant folks, intimacy is hard and commitment is hard. Avoidantly attached folks are more likely to cheat. They're more likely to have non-committal sex. They're more likely to not share close emotions or needs with their partner. And their partners, in turn, are more likely to feel that their more avoidant partner is not very supportive. On the anxious end of things, anxiously attached folks, or folks who are high on that dimension of attachment anxiety, are more likely to be very dependent on their partners, texting them all the time, and also really worried about the relationship. So they might endorse statements like, I worry a lot about my partner. I sometimes feel like I want to be close to my partner and they don't want to be as close to me. So there's this feeling of, I really want closeness, but sometimes that scares people off, in part because it's such an intense need. Their needs have not been met in childhood. And so it's like, it's more difficult to get their needs met in close relationships. And really the fear is of being abandoned. So underneath all of these kind of intense relationship patterns romantically, there's really just this feeling of, I just don't want you to leave me because I have this history of people not being reliable. For anxious folks, they tend to have a pattern of being very sensitive to rejection and to kind of make their partners anxious also. If you've got a partner who's constantly like needing your reassurance, do you really love me? Are you really there for me? Why didn't you text me back immediately? Were you out with somebody? I mean, if that is your constant experience, there's a tendency to be like, whoa, maybe we should take a pause. And so unfortunately, even though the desire is to bring people really close and keep them close, the result, sadly, is the self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes of pushing them away. So those are the two dimensions. And oftentimes what you see is that one partner who is more avoidant might elicit more anxiety from their partner, because if I'm pulling away, then of course your partner is going to want to bring you back into the relationship. Or similarly, if one partner is really secure and they're just a rock of security, even if you're insecure, you might start moving toward greater security in that relationship because this person is just so awesome. So I always like to say, you can't choose your family. You can't choose what your growing up experience was, but you can choose your friends and you can choose your romantic partners. So choose people who make you feel really safe and secure.
Wow. Okay, that was very interesting. There's like 4 tabs in my head I want to pull on there. First, the ECR. That's the by Chris Fraley, is it, or Chris Fraley? I think I took that one. That was very interesting to see. Is that like an empirically validated scale?
Yeah, we use it in our research all the time. It's got great psychometric properties if you're a research nerd. And it's very predictive of a whole bunch of stuff. So I recommend it. There are other scales out there, but that's the most widely used.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's freely available to anyone listening as well. So we can put that one in the show notes. One of the other tabs, yeah, I wanted to pull on was reading through your research. Yeah, it did seem like that. If you have this insecure attachment style, you tend to attribute your partner's behaviors in a way that exacerbates your own insecurities, right? And like you said, that self-fulfilling prophecy just kind of further instills that insecurity in yourself in that attachment style. But I know you said fluidity earlier in context. So if we look now at fluidity across the lifespan, what are the things that can move someone up or down those anxiety and avoidance dimensions of attachment styles?
I find this to be both really hopeful and also a nice challenge. You can change your attachment style. That is so clear. And the earlier you know and recognize your own attachment style, meaning the earlier in your life, the easier it is to change. So, Indy, how old are you, if you don't mind my asking?
28.
You're 28. Brilliant. So you have a better shot than someone like me being a bit older at doing the work to change your attachment style. And the reason for that is the way that our brains develop. there are these windows of plasticity, or times during which neural circuits underlying everything from learning and memory, but also social patterns, are more flexible. And one of those times is adolescence and early adulthood. So the human brain actually does not finish developing until, I mean, it never finishes developing completely, but our prefrontal cortex, for example, is still under construction all the way through age 25. It's one of the reasons why in the United States, I don't know if this is true where you are, but in the US, you can't rent a car until you're 25 because your brain is not fully developed. And so what this means for attachment is there's a huge amount of plasticity, or the ability to change neural circuits. But what it takes to change neural circuits are two things: experiences, new experiences, and practice. So continued effort and practice can rewire your neural circuitry. In terms of experience, the younger you are, the better. But no matter what your age, seeking experiences with people who are reliable sources of feeling secure and safe. That could mean therapy for some people. It could mean seeking out friendships where you remember feeling that way, but maybe you allowed the relationship to end for whatever set of reasons. And also being very mindful about your romantic partners, because you're probably, if you're an adult and you choose to be monogamous, or you choose to have some partner for a long period of time, or set of partners, those folks are the folks you're going to spend the most time with after about mid-adulthood on. So your family typically becomes less central to your social life, and partners, and to a lesser extent friends, become a bigger part. So seeking experiences where you feel safe, secure, and connected, where people are pretty reliable. So the majority of the time, they don't have to be perfect, but the majority of time they come through when they say they're going to come through. If they say, oh yeah, I'll show up for your big event at work on Thursday, I'll be there, and then they're not, that experience is feeding into your expectations of future experiences. So you can choose people who have those qualities of being reliable, supportive, and helping you feel safe and secure. The other is effort and practice. So if I should back up and just say the number one thing you can do to move toward greater security at any stage of your life is awareness. So taking that experiences in close relationship scale, for example, or just doing some internal reflection. The number one predictor of positive change in most domains is awareness of your strengths and difficulties. If I'm aware that I have a pattern of being avoidant, whenever someone tries to get close to me, even if I think I like them initially, at some point, I just stop responding to their texts. It just freaks me out and I don't respond anymore. If you know that's your pattern, that awareness is huge, because it means that when you notice yourself doing that, shutting down or freaking out, someone's getting too close to me, you have the power to make a different choice. Okay, this person texted me how I'm doing today. It's really freaking me out and I kind of don't want to respond. Maybe I just take a deep breath, give myself a day, and respond the next day, and be honest in your response. Maybe tell them just a little bit of how you're feeling that feels like this is your stretch zone. So you don't have to suddenly tell your trauma to someone you've just met. And in fact, I don't think that's a secure or healthy pattern at all. But could you, with someone you trust, just go a little further if you're avoidant? Go a little further in expressing your true needs and emotions. If you're anxious, maybe that means when you notice that you're freaking out because someone hasn't texted you back immediately, maybe taking a deep breath and saying, oh, then they're probably just busy. This probably has nothing to do with me. I'm not going to take it personally. Maybe I'll follow up with them at work tomorrow if I don't see them. So just kind of the cognitive reframe, taking some deep breaths, and practicing a more secure pattern. Over time, that does amazing things. The last thing I'll mention is, even though we think about attachment as kind of this trait, it's also an emotional state, which means at any given time, you can feel more secure. And we actually do this in some of our research studies. We prime people, meaning we ask them to think about someone who has served as a secure base for them. So I might ask you, Indy, think of the person you can most depend on to be there for you when you really need them. Just calling that person to mind and imagining their presence brings up a felt state of security. And regardless of your attachment style, so we've done this with folks who are very avoidant or very anxious, security priming floats all boats. And what I mean by that is if you're especially anxious, you get a boost of security and you behave more like a secure person. Same thing if you're avoidant. You're less likely to avoid tough stuff if I security prime you. So the research shows that security priming increases empathy, willingness to help, it reduces aggression toward outgroup members, and it improves mood. So for folks with depressive symptoms, repeatedly priming a sense of security really helps improve their mood. So I always ask my students to secure prime themselves before a difficult exam, because you really got nothing to lose. One of the amazing things about the human mind is we carry around memories of people we loved even after they've passed. So if your secure person is no longer alive, that's okay, because their memory can also be a way of arousing those same feelings.
With someone who is, insecure in their attachment style, like I said, I'm more on the avoidance side. Does that manifest as well in our future parenting, in the sense that, is it almost like cyclical, in the sense that if you have an insecure attachment style, that's more likely to play out in your own parenting style?
You nailed it. Oftentimes, these patterns of attachment are transmitted intergenerationally. There's not very much genetic contribution to attachment. So in studies of twins, for example, usually it's mostly an environmental contribution. And yet we do see patterns from one generation to another. And that's true even among adopted kids. So in other words, the parenting that you've received is often the parenting you pay forward. But there's a big caveat, which is if you have awareness of the insecure patterns in your own upbringing, again, you have so much more power to change those patterns in the next generation. So just because we tend to pay forward what we've experienced, that doesn't mean that we've got no choice in the matter. So what tends to be the case is on the adult attachment interview. So this is a different type of measure than the ECR. The adult attachment interview is really about asking people to reflect on their childhood experiences and asking for a lot of specificity. What was your relationship like with your mother? What was your relationship like with your father, or whoever those figures were? It could be an auntie, it could be a grandparent. And then asking for specific examples. And really the hallmark of secure attachment in this adult attachment interview is whether you value relationships. Do you talk about relationships in a way that indicates that you think this is important? If you do, that's a sign of secure or autonomous attachment on this particular interview. And that predicts with about 80% accuracy your future child's secure attachment to you in the strange situation. So I actually think that's tremendously helpful, because what it means is you could say, my dad was really physically abusive. He beat me, but I really think he did the best he could, and I forgive him. I really think it was important to have a relationship with him as an adult, and I want to do things differently. Even though you have this really difficult background that you're talking about it in an emotionally balanced way. You're talking about forgiveness and understanding, and you're valuing relationships. So you're still secure, even though you're describing a very, very difficult childhood. Oftentimes these folks are called earned secure, meaning maybe you weren't securely attached when you were an infant, but through maybe more recent relationships or your own internal work, you've become more secure. So that earned secure category, I think, is really beautiful because their kids are more likely to have very different experiences growing up than they did. In terms of attachment style, so both higher avoidance and higher anxiety on the ECR tend to be associated with less sensitive parenting behavior in response to kids' distress. The reason I emphasize distress is, you can be a really wonderful, playful parent when things are going well. But when you put the system under a little bit of pressure, oftentimes that's what activates our patterns. If our kid really needs us, like they had a terrible day at school and they got bullied by somebody and they come home just sobbing. For an anxious parent, the reaction might be, oh, good, they need me. But maybe they're amping up the kids' anxiety too much. Maybe they're saying, oh, I'm going to take you out of that school immediately. Or the reaction is kind of overreacting. Or maybe they have trouble when their kid goes off to school. They have trouble separating. They really want to cling to their kid. That might be one pattern. For an avoidant parent, your kid comes home sobbing. It's like, oh, I really don't want to deal with that. Like, this makes me so uncomfortable. You could try to gently challenge yourself and say, okay, this is my avoidant pattern coming up. And maybe when I was a kid, my dad was not all that nice when I had similar issues. If you recognize that, then maybe you can open just 10%. I'm so sorry that happened, sweetie. Do you want to talk about it? You can do it in your own style. You don't have to be the syrupy nice parent. That's actually not what kids need. But if you can go just a little bit into your stretch zone of being present for that difficult emotion, it'll serve you well as a parent and it'll serve your kid well. I think the most amazing and powerful thing we can give to our children is our own healing and our own calm presence. Just being present. You don't have to say the perfect thing. In fact, you can make a ton of mistakes. But as long as you show up and can be fully present for your child, no matter what they're experiencing, I think that's one of the most powerful gifts we can give.
So it's about putting the child's needs kind of above our own in a way.
I would say you have to also meet your own need. And what I say that because we can't pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes. So oftentimes, in order for you to be the best parent you can be, you need somebody else who is being a caregiver for you. That could be a partner, or it could be a good friend, or if you're lucky enough to have good relationships with your own family, it takes a village to raise a child. And part of that is because you also need support as a parent. So you don't have to do it alone. But there are certain ways where I think following the child's need or following the child's lead, however you want to put it, can be helpful in the sense of you're an adult, so you've got more strategies and abilities. For a kid, because their nervous system is not developed yet, so they actually can't downregulate when they're really little without your help. From that perspective, you do have to put their needs first because you are calibrating their nervous system. And you've got this adult nervous system that has its own internal rhythms and actually has more capacity. So from that perspective, yeah, you're putting their needs first. And yet, you also need to fill your own cup somehow.
Well, either way, it sounds very empowering knowing that, if you have an insecure attachment style from your own childhood, that, there are things you definitely can do to strive towards that ideal of a secure attachment style with your own child.
100%, yeah. For folks who are wanting help in this regard, there are some amazing evidence-based attachment parenting programs. So Circle of Security is one that I've worked quite a bit on. And there's another called Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-up, or ABC. So for people who are interested, you can go to, I think it's like abc.org and circleofsecurityinternational.org, something like that. But there are these two amazing programs that can really help support parents and give you the tools you need to become aware of your own upbringing and be the best parent you can be for your child. And both of them really take the view that no matter how difficult your circumstances or your background, everybody has the capacity to be an amazing secure base, and you don't have to be perfect. So I think it's a really lovely view. There's another program for couples that's got a lot of great evidence behind it called emotion-focused therapy that was developed by Sue Johnson and her colleagues. And that is really about attachment dynamics in couples. So if I'm anxious and you're avoidant, how can we move this interaction pattern that we're getting stuck in that leads to a lot of conflict? How can we move that to more security? So we're turning toward each other in times of conflict. So I would say you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to do this work alone. There's both individual therapy and these great programs to help people out.
I'll have a look at those and link them, put some links in the show notes for people to check out, because that does sound very useful. Is there anything kind of finally that you wanted to touch on? You have the floor to speak to listeners. Any kind of advice or anything you wanted to impart on people?
Well, if there are any parents of teens who might listen, I would just say that during adolescence, it's normal for teens to distance themselves from parents and to become more oriented toward their peer group. And that's actually a normal and beautiful part of growing up. But part of what that means is that there will be more conflict, and that's also normal, even if you have a secure attachment. The most important thing is that you can be available for your teen as they go and navigate maybe their first romantic relationship or their first really close friendship, and to be grounded in your value as a parent. Even if it doesn't look like they need you, they still need you. And for teens, you might go through periods of being totally enraged at your parent, but try to be patient with them. I think during COVID, there was a period of time where teens couldn't do what they most needed to developmentally, which was to go out into the world and have a great group of peers. So I think one of the challenges we have as a society is, as we emerge from this time of pandemic stress, how do we meet the social and mental health needs of young people, especially? So I'm hoping that people who might be interested in this, listeners who want to go into the mental health field, might think about the needs of young people, especially during this time of pandemic making those needs more evident.